All right, it's Richard Wolff time. It's time to get serious. All right, I've actually already seen this video. So while y'all watch Richard Wolff, I am going to run and grab my water or refill my water because I'm dying of thirst. But this is a 5-minute video, so I will be back before it's over.
This is Richard Wolff from Democracy at Work with another Wolff Responds. I'd like to speak with you today about U.S. capitalism, the condition of the U.S. economy right now. I think it's at a crucial point. I think big changes are coming. I think it deserves way more attention than it is getting, particularly from the perspective I would like to offer now. We are coming off 2.5 years almost now of one of the worst periods in the history of U.S. capitalism. We suffered at the same time a major public health disaster, COVID-19, and the second worst collapse of our economic system since the Great Depression of the 1930s. 2020 and 2021 were the combined experience of that. More than half of our labor force suffered unemployment for some period of that time. Losses of jobs, losses of self-esteem, losses of homes, losses of income, and losses of a sense of a future. All of those over 2 years plus, devastating. But then this capitalist system went one further step. It hit this country with an unconscionable inflation. As if the other 2 years weren't worse enough, capitalism is showing us what it is capable of. Prices are rising 8 to 10% a year on average. Wages are not keeping up, not even close. Therefore, the inequality, which got worse through the pandemic and the crash, is getting still worse through the inflation. And now the final step, which provoked this video. Major banks in this country are telling us that because of the devastating inflation and all the economic damage it is causing on top of everything else, the government is going to step in to try to stop or slow the inflation by raising interest rates. It's already begun. May and June are scheduled to be big further increases. And at least 3 banks, Goldman Sachs, Deutsche Bank, and the Bank of America, have now predicted a recession at the end of this year or early next year as a consequence of rising interest rates. It's too much. These kinds of repeated blows to the working class of this country, the vast majority of people who don't own significant amounts of stock, who depend on their jobs for the incomes they and their families need. We are now saying to them, you really don't matter. And they're angry, and they're bitter, and the social conflicts and divisions and angers and rages are getting worse by the hour.
So we heard recently that the Fed is going to be bracketing up, increasing the benchmark interest rates that are allowed. So this video from Richard Wolff was 5 months ago. And 5 months ago, he was able to predict that the big banks were going to do this using Marxist economics. And it's really hard to predict when a recession or a so-called crash will happen, especially because the Fed can push them back using methods like this. But Wolff basically predicts what's going to happen. And when you compare Marxist economics to bourgeois economics, which, like I was saying earlier, I studied a bit in college, not as much as I wanted to, but a handful. Your bourgeois economics is, it's revealed that it's just a pseudoscience, right? It's literally just the science of how do we keep capitalism going, and how do we maximize profit without, letting the system collapse in on itself. It's not an actual science analyzing economics and what the best way to organize economics would be. When you talk about this like Western Milton Friedmanite trickle down economics or Austrian economics. So if we read this article from CNN, Fed goes big again with third straight 3/4 point rate hike. So they've been increasing the interest rates for a long time. And they say that this is an aggressive move to tackle white hot inflation that's been plaguing the U.S. economy. So it's framed as just a way to stop inflation, right? We have to increase the interest rates because prices are increasing, which is true. Richard Wolff says that prices are increasing 8 to 10% a year, while wages are, of course, not increasing. But, even bourgeois economics admits that recessions are inevitable, that you get recessions every once in a while, that the system is just bound to fall into crises and completely crash and leave a bunch of people destitute. They call it the business cycle. And they say when there's a recession, though, eventually things go back up, and they get better, and you just have to wait it out. Which is ridiculous because in a socialist system, you could prevent recession. But that's just an example of how bourgeois economics will never, ever, ever criticize the system, right? They don't see a system that crashes every once in a while and just leaves a huge mass of the population in a terrible situation, unemployed and unable to meet their basic needs. They're like, oh, I guess this is just the business cycle. It's got to be this way because the market always works. Got to trust the invisible hand. And then really their job as economists just becomes keeping the system going. And Marxist economics, like what Richard Wolff said, always gives us a better explanation than bourgeois economics, mainstream economics, and CNN. Because it is allowed to criticize the system. It does see the contradictions of the system at its core. It sees the roots of these things like economic crises. It's rooted in overproduction. And the increase of interest rates isn't just to combat inflation. It's to keep the profits of the bankers and the industrial capitalists high. So in Lenin's Imperialism, he talks about when capitalism enters its imperialist stage, you have the banks merge with the industrial capitalists. So say like U.S. or Chase Bank merging with the oil companies. And, that makes it easier to move around their money and to move around their capital. And like any capitalist, these banks and industrial capitalists that we call finance capital have to continually increase their profits and their revenue. They have to expand and expand and grow and grow and grow. Otherwise, they'll go under, and they're used to a certain amount of revenue, which at this point, is massive. So these crises of overproduction are these capitalist firms not being able to maintain their absurd revenues, right? Because they're not just paying for production. They're not just paying for the wages of the worker and then the tools, the means of production. They're paying giant, massive shareholder payouts, which have to keep growing and growing and growing. And if they don't, the system will crash. So that's why they're increasing interest rates so they can charge people more for their debt and keep the profits of bankers high and prevent the economy from going under. Because, of course, the profits of these shareholders can never be questioned. Those can never be reduced. We can't ever nationalize the banks, and take the profit out of it. So we don't have to continually raise prices and increase interest rates on people with debt to keep the bank's profits high enough. They never offer some kind of alternative system like Richard Wolff does as a Marxist. Yeah, and then eventually, you have a situation like what happened in 2008 where they keep raising interest rates higher and higher and higher. And now, today they're at their highest rate since 2008. And then eventually people just can't pay them back, right? People don't have enough money to pay it back. So the banks and the feds and the Fed push this crisis of overproduction back, using paper shuffling and financial magic. But eventually people aren't going to be able to pay it back. And that's just, the workers not being able to buy back the products that they create, the crisis of overproduction that Marx talks about in Capital. And then firms crash, people lose their jobs. That means people have less money to buy commodities. That means more firms crash, and you get a recession. And no matter what they tell you, profit has something to do with it, right? Because these firms go under when they can't maintain and continually expand profits. And if these companies were nationalized and worker owned, they wouldn't need to maintain billions of dollars a year in shareholder profits. Everybody else be damned. I remember the 2008 recession. Not a good time. I didn't understand money at the time. I just remember my parents being real stressed and talking about economics for the first time in my life. And I was like, this is boring. Money's stupid. What are you guys so worried about money and politics for? Back when everything was good. When we didn't have to worry about money. Everyone always says that, like, enjoy being a kid. It's the best time of your life. But they don't tell you it's because, when you're an adult, you have to sell yourself into wage slavery in order to survive and put food on the table for your family. You don't understand that until you're 15 or 16. You get a minimum wage job and you work your butt off for an hour and you get $7.25 and you can barely buy a popsicle and you're like, And your boss is a gazillionaire and you're like, this is weird. And then the old people are like, just shut up and accept it. This is the only way. And you're like, I don't know about that. Other people who work at this golf course with me